The French mathematician Alexandre Grothendieck was the king of mathematical abstraction and the field's laureate. This remarkable man combined genius and all-consuming love of mathematics that didn't, however, influence his decision to give it up, as well as extremely naive political views and unusually closed mind. Alexander Grothendieck's parents were anarchists. His father, a refugee from Russia, Alexander Stasha Shapiro, an active participant in the 1905 revolution, was sentenced to death, commuted to imprisonment because he was underage. He repeatedly attempted to escape, and during one such escape was wounded in the arm, which had to be amputated. He arrived in Germany with a false identity under the name of Alexander Tannerov, a name often used by Grothendieck's biographers. He also used the clandestine name of Sasha Peter. Considering it unacceptable for an anarchist to work for an exploiter, he was a street photographer. His mother, Johanna Hanke Grothendieck, was born into a burgher family, but embraced the ideas of anarchism, left her parents for Berlin, and wrote articles for leftist newspapers about avant-garde art and politics. As opponents of the bourgeois family, they didn't register their marriage, so Schurig was formally considered the son of a single mother and carried her last name, which helped him survive the Nazi regime. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, Grothendieck's father, as a Jew, had to flee to France. At the end of the year, his mother followed him as well. The child was placed in foster care in the Heydorn family on the outskirts of Hamburg. His parents took an active part in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans. After the Franco victory, they returned to France. By this time, the terror in Germany was increasing. Not only did they begin to identify Jews by their documents, but they also became interested in those who didn't conform to the canons of the Aryan race. So it was dangerous for little Schurig to stay, and his adoptive parents themselves had 4 children. They contacted Schurig's parents and sent him to them shortly before the war began. In 1940, Grothendieck's parents and himself were interned. The father was sent to the Auschwitz death camp, where he died. Mother and son were imprisoned in an internment camp in Riekro. The order in this camp was fairly tolerable, and Schurig was allowed to attend a lyceum in a nearby town. At the lyceum, he often had to fight with students who thought he was an invader, not knowing that his parents were anti-fascists. Once he even escaped from the camp, determined to get to Hitler and kill him, but luckily it didn't end badly for him. 2 years later, mother and son separated. Hanke was sent to another camp, and Schurig ended up in an orphanage in the city, Chambon-sur-Lignon, run by the Swiss aid charity, which rescued Jewish, anti-fascist and refugee children. To complete his secondary education, he enrolled at a college Savinal. Even then, it became clear to him that he had great mathematical ability. When the war ended, his mother found her son and they began to live in Montpellier, where Alexander entered the local university. He had to work part-time picking grapes while his mother worked as a housekeeper for the surrounding owners. He wanted to be a mathematician by then, but his analysis teacher, Sula, told him that mathematics was a nearly complete science, the last great discoveries in it being made by Liebig. A curious thing happened. The content of Liebig's works the teacher didn't know or had forgotten. There were no books, but Grothendieck was quite independently interested in the exact definition of length, area and volume, considering the definition in textbooks insufficiently rigorous, and independently came to the basic concepts of Liebig's measure theory and integral. In 1948, Grothendieck arrived in Paris after graduation to continue his education. When Grothendieck was asked what he had been doing in Montpellier, he described his work on measure theory, seeing that he had made a great discovery, though one made long before by Liebig's and entirely on his own. He was encouraged to continue his scientific work. Grothendieck had difficulties at a seminar of Cartan, both because of his poor education obtained at a provincial college and because of his poor French, especially among a small group of permanent students. So on the advice of Cartan and Dieudonné, he moved to Nancy, a city which at that time was one of the main centers of mathematical thought in France in 1949. The famous Nicolas Bourbaki, pseudonym of a group of mathematicians, was a professor from Nankago, that is Nancy plus Chicago. At that time, the mentioned Dieudonné, Louis Schwartz, Delsart, and Gaudemann were working in Nancy from Bourbaki. Under the direction of Dieudonné and Schwarz, Grothendieck is engaged in research in functional analysis. Schwarz gave him 6 possible questions as topics for his thesis. By the required deadline, all of them were completely solved by Grothendieck. The most important of these became his dissertation, which was later published as a monograph in 1955 and reprinted several times. Nevertheless, Grothendieck has difficulties getting a job. He was a stateless person, and if he obtained citizenship, he would have been subject to conscription, which he didn't want, because of his negative attitude as a pacifist toward military duty. Eventually, he became an employee of the famous Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. But the job was more of a temporary one. He even considered becoming a carpenter for a living to support his ailing mother. But in 1953, he was invited to work at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. In 1955, he works at the University of Kansas. At this time, he loses interest in functional analysis and begins to study algebra, especially homological algebra and algebraic geometry. In 1956, he returned to Paris, where he became a permanent member of the CNRS and a member of Bourbaki. It should be noted that Grothendieck's work as a member of Bourbaki was considerably less active than that of the other members, and Grothendieck's attitude towards the activities of the group was far from unconditionally supportive. Grothendieck was greatly influenced by his correspondence with G.P. Serres on the theory of bundles, introduced by G. Lehrer. Serres also introduced him to the so-called hypothesis of Weyl, which pointed to the connection between the discrete world of algebraic manifolds and the continuous world of topology. Grothendieck also dealt with the Riemann-Roch theorem and proved the profound generalization of this theorem with the help of the so-called algebraic key theory that he created. 1958 was, as he himself claimed, the most fruitful period of his life. He read his famous paper at the 13th Mathematic Congress in Edinburgh, where he systematically expounded the concept of schema theory, which became the basis of modern algebraic geometry. Also, in 1958, the famous Institut des Hautes Études Scientifiques was founded, where Grothendieck began to work. There he published his famous work Éléments de géométrie algébrique, a book which became known biblically as Grothendieck's Gospel and which had a fundamental influence on algebraic geometry. Equally important was the seminar on algebraic geometry, the work of which was of great importance. Grothendieck didn't hold systematic political views such as an anarchist, socialist or communist, but as a man with a keen conscience and the perception of the world in black and white, he was known for his active stance in life. In protest against the suppression of dissent in the USSR, the Sinevsky-Daniel trial, Grothendieck refused to go to Moscow for the 1966 Fields Congress, where he was to receive the Fields Prize, but went to Vietnam in the middle of the war, where he lectured on ethal topology to students at the evacuated Hanoi University in the jungle. The denouement came in the late 1960s, during the Paris Spring of the 1968. Grothendieck noticed that his fellow mathematicians largely supported not the students but the bourgeois government, which angered him. In 1969, he learns that the Institute for Higher Scientific Research, where he was worked for many years, is partially funded by the military and quits. Further, he draws attention to the fact that mathematicians are also divided into aristocracy and serfs, and that a peculiar process of exploitation takes place when an influential scientist receives the work of a young mathematician. Especially not his student, he rejects it under plausible pretext. It's not relevant, it is a dead-end way, and etc. And he himself uses ideas of rejected work in his own work. All the more so, the work of young mathematicians is often simply ignored. He also pointed out the existence of scientific mafias. Grothendieck withdraws to Montpellier, where he once independently discovered the theory of measure, quitting mathematics. He is still partly engaged in biology, ecology, and even esotericism. In 1977, he is put on trial for providing housing to an illegal immigrant. Only some of his former colleagues and friends supported him. Most were indifferent and some even opposed him. In 1988, he was awarded, along with C. student Deline, the Crawford Prize, which he refused. From 1990 until his death in 2014, he lived in the French Pyrenees and was hardly ever heard from. 12 mathematicians had access to him. Thank you for watching to the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Brain Green so you don't miss the next video.